Listen, it's 9:05. I'm going to give my little monologue as I often do for these events. Welcome. Like I said at the very, very beginning when we first hopped on, yeah, we're wrapping up Hispanic Heritage Month. I recognize it was, October 15th, but it really starts 2 weeks before September 15th and ends 2 weeks afterwards. And we're going into Day of the Dead. So, Dia de los Muertos es algo que celebrar, nuestra familia, our ancestors. So good morning. Muy buenos días a todos. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for today's People's Policy series. So I'm diverging a little bit. We are diverging a little bit from our usual policy emphasis to examine some of the cultural aspects related to U.S.-Mexico border, the personal impacts of migration, living as a Latino, Latina in the United States, culture clashes, and the challenges faced by individuals living and working in this country and their status, right? So we're joined today by Sergio Troncoso. He's a novelist whose personal story took him from the border in Texas all the way. I didn't put together the Harvard piece, but first to Harvard and then to Yale. We met. He reached out to us because he was doing a book reading, and I was just really compelled by the story in the book, and so I just on a whim, I invited him to speak to us because his books include themes, that I mentioned at the beginning, but also what we've been talking about every day and the different work we do day in and day out. And so we thought it was important to reflect on our cultures within the larger social landscape, the bilateral relations of all of our countries here and, that we're from originally, and then within the larger social landscape of Maryland, specifically in the United States. And Sergio is going to help us do that. So before we get started, just a reminder, you can put comments and questions for Sergio and I in the chat. We'll do everything we can to answer as many as possible, but also put your names and where you're from. You can put your country of origin if you like, or you can just say your county. They both work. So Sergio Troncoso's book, Nobody's Pilgrim, begins with a description of border life in Ysleta, Texas. And it's a story of Turi, which is a nickname for our shortened version of Arturo, Arthur, a 17-year-old kid in high school whose mom dies in a car accident. And he's left to live with his tia, his aunt. And I'm sorry, but I gave him an adjective, her deadbeat boyfriend. You have to read the book. And his cousin, who's a young woman in the same age as he is, 17, but very different attitude compared to him. So Turi he hides in his books. He loves to read. He's befriended the librarian, and he's first forced to work on a chicken farm in the summertime to pay for his way to be in the household, right? And when he's at the chicken farm, he meets Arnulfo, and Arnulfo is undocumented. I believe he came from Juarez, yes. But he basically is trying to get away from the border, get away from ICE, and make money. And both of them end up basically escaping this, the poverty and violence surrounding them on the border. They steal a truck. This is a fast-paced book, guys. They steal a truck from a guy named Juanito, who is working for a contraband trafficker, who is also the owner of the chicken farm. And I'll leave it there because he meets Molly. There's all kinds of adventures along the way. But the book is very, very deep. And it subtly describes different lives that come together because of the U.S.-Mexico border. Life as an immigrant or as a migrant, moving from one part of the U.S. to another. He really masterfully dominates what I call border life and U.S. cultures. And linguistically, he just slides through the patterns of our language, both as a Mexicana I'm not from the border, but if I were a Mexicano from the border, and also here in the U.S. and our regionalisms. And he really, it's a great set of observations, I think, for all of us that we could maybe express ourselves in a different way about these things that we work in day to day. And I think he does this by by showing us the pain of the characters, some of the shock that happens with culture clashing. Some of it is really funny, and sometimes it's a little bit obnoxious, the contrast that he weaves for us. So no more about the book, no more about my commentary on the characters. But I welcome you, Sergio. Bienvenido to our program. Good morning. ¿Cómo estás? I
Pues
want to
muy bien.
start.
I'm
Muy bien, muy bien.
excited, muy bien. Estoy
Qué
muy
bueno.
contento estar aquí. I'm very excited, and I love to sort of get into a discussion about the book and so many themes because it is written as a thriller, but as anyone who's sort of looked at my life, I studied philosophy. There's a lot of underlying philosophical issues, and it's my 8th book. I've been writing a lot about the border and what it means to go beyond the border, what it meant to begin on the border, the cultural values I learned that allowed me to succeed, and be who I am, and not enough of that I think is written about. I think in many writers.
Well, tell us. I agree. And that was the other thing. I love borders. It's kind of my thing. But tell me a little bit about tell us about your personal story. Because you also, like I said at the beginning, you went from the border to an Ivy League school and had this, Ivy League education. You've traveled all over Mexico, it appears, and lived in Mexico City, where I was born. How, and now you're a novelist, the great American novel. And tell us a little bit about that journey, because I think that it would help us understand, because I think it's very much like some of our journeys, but there's always elements that affect all of us.
Right. So the first thing I tell my students when I do my workshops at Yale, because I teach nonfiction and fiction at Yale, is that I probably grew up with poorer than most, or if not everyone in the room. I grew up with an outhouse in the backyard and kerosene lamps and stoves. And so we did not have electricity. And my parents were Mexicanos from Chihuahua.
And this was in Ysleta.
Right. Yeah, my parents were from Chihuahua. And Ysleta is this little hamlet on the outskirts of El Paso. And back then, when I was growing up, it was rural. So the streets were made out of dirt. It was a colonia, really. It didn't have city services like electricity or running water. And so the new Mexican immigrants at that time, basically in the late 50s and 60s, were coming into, to this places. And of course, it always shocks people, at least people in New Haven, but maybe not everybody here, that there are colonias in Texas. And of course, there are colonias in Texas right now, places that are unincorporated, that are really receiving the poorest of the poor immigrants. And so from there, I think people say, well, how did you begin like that and then end up at Harvard and end up at Yale? I had, my father was a self-taught, largely engineer, and I was a bookworm. I was this chubby kid who loved to read, and you'll see this in Nobody's Pilgrims too, because one of the ways Turi and Molly connect, they're from very different worlds. She's working class white girl from Missouri, and he's from Ysleta, where I'm from. Is they love books, they love words. And so as a chubby kid, I loved to read. So I would amass
Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah, Huckleberry Finn, among other books that they love. But as a kid, I amassed hundreds, if not thousands, of little paperback books from the Scholastic Book Club, that you would get every Friday or every 2 or 3 Fridays. And my father, who worked in construction, he wasn't a big reader. My mother was a reader. He built bookshelves for me in my room, and so encouraged this, and I was surrounded by, Ysleta was full of gangs. Are probably the 2 doors away from my house, from our adobe house, was the leader of one of the gangs in our neighborhood, Barraca. and his name was I only knew him as El Muerto, the dead.
Those nicknames.
Right. That was just he was the leader of the Barraca gang on my side. And then the other side across an irrigation canal where the cemetery was, where the old Ysleta church was Calavera for the cemetery. So skeleton town. And Ysleta, for people who don't know, was founded in the 1600s by the Tigua Indians. So it is actually older than the United States and older than even El Paso proper. So it's a sort of an ancient community, but a very poor community. And so becoming a
So
book.
is it a desert region? I got the feeling.
Oh yeah.
If
It's a
I remember
Chihuahua
correctly, very
desert.
arid, right? It's Chihuahua. All right, Chihuahua Desert. Got it. So Chihuahua, everyone, for those who don't know, is the northern state in Mexico that abuts part of Texas, because Texas is abutted by several states.
Yeah, and I think, anyone who wants to sort of understand how I went from A to B, from Ysleta and growing up like that to Harvard and Yale, it has to begin with reading. It has to begin with, with this love of words that began very early.
Did your parents encourage you to go to university when you were a little kid?
Oh, they didn't know. I mean, my father went to an agricultural school in Juarez, Hermanos Escobar, because that was the only school that his father could afford. So they had never been to school in the US. My mother eventually got her GED in El Paso, but they had no clue what the Ivy League was. They had no clue what Harvard, Yale, Stanford was. I had to fill out the forms to get financial aid. I mean, I was a Pell Grant kid, so that should tell you the poorest of the poor kids.
We'll talk about that.
Right. And
we got
there was
some Supreme Court justices to talk to.
Yeah. And there was a lot of, storytelling in my family. I don't know if you want to ask me, like, when people say, well, how did you start morphing into writing and storytelling? Well, I mean, I had two big influences in my life, as a kid. On the one hand, it was more of an intellectual influence. My grandfather, if you go home right now, type in Santiago Troncoso on Google. Go type it in.
All right, I'll type it in and I'll put it in the chat.
And you'll find out that there's a big boulevard in Juarez named after my grandfather. So my grandfather was editor and publisher of El Día, the daily newspaper, the first daily newspaper in Juarez in the 1920s and 30s. And so he was thrown in jail something like 30 or 40 times. His print shop was firebombed several times because he would write anti-corruption articles against the Mexican government. So he was one influence, but he was more of an intellectual influence, and he was my father's father. And then my mother's mother, Doña Dolores Rivero, was probably more important because she was her family they were Villistas. They fought and died with fighting for Francisco Villa, for Pancho Villa during the revolution.
During the revolution. It's so one thing about border culture in El Paso in particular is the revolution took place literally across the street from it. And there's a hotel in El Paso that the legend is people would stand up on the top of the hotel and watch the revolution like television on the other side. It's kind of a crazy story.
And it's not a legend, it's true. And more than that, by the way.
Well, in the hotel, they call it a legend.
Well, and I mean, what people don't realize is Pancho Villa would go to El Paso to make huge armament deals and get his financing for the revolution from El Paso people, from Texas people. So there was a lot of money and arms going back because arms dealers, just like they do today, were funding and making a lot of money from the violence.
That's right.
And so that's an old story. And so just to finish my grandmother's side, because she really is the most important person in terms of my muse. She had shot and killed two men as a teenager who attempted to rape her.
Oh my word!
During the revolution. And so she was this caraja, this tough woman who my parents were afraid of. And her husband, my grandfather, who was really my step
She was an
grandfather,
Adelita.
right? Yeah, my step grandfather, he was a gardener, and if he didn't hand over his money from gardening, as soon as he walked in the door, she'd take a broomstick and hit him on the head with it.
Oh dear.
So it was feminism before there was feminism. It was violent feminism, and that was, So for me as a young kid, who do I want to hang out with? This woman who is the most interesting personality, who had great violent stories that she would tell me on her porch, that were real, about her
Mm-hmm.
life, about her experience in the revolution. And so the storytelling came from her. The oral storytelling really came from Doña Dolores. And
Mm-hmm.
the very, very first story I wrote in my first book, The Last Tortilla, is called The Abuelita. And it's about this unfiltered woman who is the boss of her family, and has these great stories to tell. And so anyway, and by the way, she makes an appearance, I don't know if you notice, in Nobody's Pilgrims as a
Is
memory,
she the one? Uh-huh.
and Turi.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Because
So,
as I tell people, if you want to know how to survive, you would need to listen to a person like my abuelita.
right. Which
Survive
reminds
a
me a lot about the themes that, when we work in a multicultural environment, one of the things about our community that I think is a really important cultural trait is our familismo, which is our sort of our basis in family is a powerful, important structure. And what I see, from what you're writing, and you're coming from a family perspective, but you're also coming from your environmental perspective of what living in Ysleta, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border was like, right? And it's a bit of a harsh reality.
right.
I think I feel at the beginning there's some scenes that for me were hard to read. Um, they were not because they were brutal or horrible, but just it's very descriptive. And I feel you really touched on the heart of many of the challenges that folks feel when they're migrating. I mean, there's I don't need to be told. You don't tell us that Turi is very poor and that the folks there are poor. You're describing it, and you do it in graphic detail, but I think it really transports the reader. And you feel the fear, Turi's fear. You feel the environment, the vulnerabilities that he is feeling as a young man. I mean, the boyfriend beats him up badly, and there's a moment where he just decides, I'm leaving, I'm out of here, I'm gonna go join Arnulfo on a journey. And they steal a bus, or sorry, a truck from Juanito, etc. But before that, like, there's this whole journey that Turi, he's bleeding, he's hurt, and he's struggling, right? And to walk to get to the bus stop or the place where Arnulfo, the young undocumented friend from the chicken farm, is going to meet the guy with the truck. And there's a lot of discussion, not discussion, but you show a certain how illicitness just becomes part of daily life, right? So talk to us a little bit about the border and the environment and how it plays, I think, in our American imagination. And why do you think it's so hard for folks in the United States to understand it?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest reason is that people don't go there.
Mm.
People don't get stories, or enough stories, from there, and they sort of look at it in an abstract quality, whatever the New York Times says or the Washington Post says.
Mm.
And
Fair point.
so for me, it's this distance, not just physical distance, but cultural distance. And I think, one of the things I've learned after living in Harvard, and I'm talking to you from New York City right now, it's where I live.
He's now on the East Coast.
And yeah, I'm now on the East Coast. is that too many stereotypes are made about the border.
Mm.
And and you're right.
Do any offend you?
Yeah, of course, all the time. I mean, it's hardly a week goes by. But what I would say is that the poverty of the border for me was also about resilience.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just about shocking people. Resilience, toughness, like my abuelitas or people like Arnulfo.
Real strength in
People,
you.
people overcoming where they began. And I think that's very important to understand because I would go to Harvard, or just to describe my kids who grew up on the Upper West Side of New York City, I would tell them, oh, your friends don't know how to work. They don't know how to work like a Mexican. They don't know how to work until you drop,
Oh dear.
and then do it again the next day, and then
Mm-hmm.
do it again the next day. And that is your pace. And so for me, that's what I got from the border. Like, I got that sort of toughness, resilienceness, that I will not be defeated attitude that my abuelita gave me.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember some writers, and even Steve Inskeep from NPR once brought a whole crew to interview me in Ysleta with my parents, and he was shocked.
I was
And
going to ask, how
he
did he
was
react?
he was shocked. He said, "You grew up here?" And it's a small little house made out of adobe, and it is barely a working class neighborhood
Mm.
within walking distance of Mexico.
Do a lot of
And
people migrate from Ysleta?
from there and leave?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Do you
I mean,
see that? Are you
I
seeing
think
it
some
out?
people do. They end up going to the better parts of El Paso. So
Mm.
you're migrating 10 miles or 5 miles or whatever. Um, and occasionally people leave to the East Coast or leave to the West Coast. But I think for me, yeah, you grew up poor. Yes, you grew up with a lot of difficulty around you. But for me, it's also taught me resiliency, taught me to imagine what I could do, and taught me to overcome
Mm-hmm.
issues. And so for me, I think when you grow up with too much, I think that's a disadvantage.
I
Uh,
agree.
I think it's a disadvantage
I'm
because I will
spoiled.
not be defeated. People don't realize I will not be defeated. You say, well, how did you produce just your ninth book? I just finished my ninth book. It's because I have this mentality from my parents, which is nothing is given to you. You have to fight for every inch you get, and you have to set up your life to do that. And so I learned all of these things from the border. And one of the reasons I started writing stories like my abuelitas and all these other stories and books that I've written was to show people what I would consider the real border,
Mm-hmm.
which, not sort of the stereotypical, oh, there's the poor community. I don't have anything I need to learn from that poor community. And that's actually the wrong thing to think about. And anybody would learn from the resiliency and the grit of these three kids, of Turi, Arnulfo, and then Molly, who is a poor white girl from Missouri, because they will not give up on their community. They don't belong with anyone else. They only belong with themselves. And
Right.
this is a message I've been trying to convey to people in more ways than one.
Mm-hmm. The resiliency is really powerful and in all three characters. Um, so let me ask you. You mentioned you were just talking about borders and border stories and the history and sort of how that plays out and Steven Skeep's reaction, like, really, you came from here? But there's also something you meant talk a lot about, and it just struck me because that's the one thing I remember from living on the U.S. Mexico border, and it's border mentalities, right? You describe a Mr. Dunbar, and you call him, you always talk about his sky blue eyes, right?
Right.
He speaks Spanish like a native,
Oh
but
yeah.
he's adopted and this was a little creepy for me, but I think I'm not the only one in the book, right? not that I'm in your book, but he adopted idioms that were really traditional to the border culture in Spanish. And he would say them. And then he would do, he would kiss the cross and say, Cuida mis niños, Dios Todopoderoso, take care of my children, powerful, all powerful God. And his Mexican workers would be like, what? Because it was like a cognitive dissonance for them. Right. And you describe it beautifully. But then you go into this whole issue of border mentality, and it has to do with Mr. Dunbar. And it's really a disdain for folks on the East Coast, people in New York and London, and you say, I have to read this, border mentality and the disdain for New York and London, what those places can deliver to someone with a little brains and perspective. Because Mr. Dunbar is like kind of saying, I think we're limiting ourselves. Then you realize this guy is also a predator, right? And he's making his money scamming, laundering, running illicit contraband, all kinds of stuff, which is also part of the book, and I won't give away the story. And he uses people. Not only, see, he's also the owner of the chicken farm, right? So he's using the workers, but he's also using everybody around him just to make money. And it really gave me, to me, it was just a really interesting juxtaposition of border mentality. This, the comparison to big cities, the difference between the white community and the Mexican community who live together and are dependent on one another. And then this idea of gringo, right, in border culture, because it's not really a pejorative. It's just, that's just what you call
the
gringos. Could you talk a little bit about border mentalities?
Sure.
Because also the issue of language, right?
Yeah.
The dominant culture versus submissive.
Right. And I mean, the interesting thing about the book, I think, is that my bad guys are as important to me as a writer as Turi, Molly, and Arnulfo. And John Broadus Dunbar is one of the many, very important, I would hope humanistic bad guys who are after these kids. Who and the interesting thing about John Broadus Dunbar, his ancestors went to the Alamo. If you would see him from afar, he is a gringo, an Americano, an Anglo, as they would say in El Paso, who doesn't have any connection to Mexican culture. But the reality is he's actually deeply into Mexican culture. He's probably intermarried, and his Spanish is fluent. And by the way, in El Paso, on the border, speaking of the border mentality, you're Anglo if you're Italian. You're Anglo if you're Jewish. Right. You're Anglo if you're anything but Mexican. And why? Because in El Paso, 85% of the people are Mexicanos.
That's right.
And so
I love El Paso myself. Right. And what I love about it is that you can't, if you you go into the mayor's office and you're in his or her suite, and it oversees all of El Paso and Juarez. It's like, wow. And it looks like one city, whether in the daytime or at night. In the daytime, you can see where the border entrance is, but it's one city.
Right. It really is, by this tiny little canal that they call the Rio Grande. But just to get to John Broadus Dunbar a little bit, I wanted to see the deep interactions that someone who is Anglo and ostensibly a respectable businessman, who's actually doing all sorts of dirty stuff underneath, illegal, dangerous things underneath this facade, the deep connections he has to Mexico, to Spanish, because that is the border mentality, that the Anglos have for generations intermarried with the rich Mexicans on the Juarez side, and vice versa, and that everyone from the poor people to the rich people are all Mexicanos, and then you have this sprinkling of Anglos, whether they're Jewish or Italian or Irish or whoever. You have to learn the border lingo, the border mentality, because that's how you succeed. That's your major market. That is all, the bankers, the lawyers, the poor people. And so So John Broadus Dunbar is very much of a, almost like you could even call him an honorary Latino.
He
And
is. He is. And that's the thing, like what you described, the kissing of the cross, and then, God, take
right,
care of my kids, God, thank you, obviously in very floral Spanish. And it just, you weave this in and out, but then you do the same with Molly and her isms,
right.
her country girl isms. So, by the way, you mentioned markets, right? And the importance of the blending. And Veronica put a question in the chat. And it says, I can't wait to dive in the book with all the challenges that we have as a community and our kids not having exposure to authors like you, nor to stories like Nobody's Pilgrim. How do we get more of our books published?
Oh,
And
that's such a great question.
and then how do we encourage our people to buy these books to support the market?
Oh my
Well,
gosh.
that's why we're having this conversation today.
Well, no, I mean, the first thing is read us, for
Yes.
God's sake. And then if you do read the book and you get something out of it, oh, for Pete's sake, review it on Amazon, review it on Goodreads. Not enough of
Give it as a
upper,
birthday gift.
absolutely no. I mean, that's what matters. And I've been an evangelist for that for all my life. I was selected president of the Texas Institute of Letters, and I appointed more Mexicano, Latino, Latinas as chair people of our awards committee, so that we would reward more books from the border, so that I got Benjamina Lire Saenz the Lifetime Achievement Award, which she should have won 20 years ago. And so it is a constant battle simply to be taken seriously as an author, because you're writing about the border. And it begins with our own community, which is we don't support each other. We don't read about these questions and these authors, and yet these authors are winning. I mean, I've been published in the Yale Review. The Yale Review is the oldest literary review in the country. As they told me, the editors told me, Louis Gluck, who won the Nobel Prize, was published regularly in the Yale Review. And the editor told me, this is the first time Ysleta they thought Mexican characters were in the Yale Review. And so the quality is there. The painstaking chiseling of phrases and sentences are there, but for some reason, because we decide to write about Turi or Anulfo, or I have a funny name like Troncoso, you don't get Latino readers reading you, or you do get them. I mean, I'm publishing, but not enough, and it's never enough.
Well, it just strikes me that the stories you're writing are very relevant to many of the people from Central America who've come here today. You talked about your grandmother and the revolution. We have folks who escaped civil war, who were children's soldiers at 14, who are now, business owners and who've been here, 30 years, and their children are now starting to explore and get into college, et cetera. And so I see a lot of parallel. You're talking from a Mexican perspective and the US-Mexico border perspective, but that carries as as an immigrant, many crossed that border to get here.
Right.
So they have, even within whoever is crossing, that's their own immigrant experience. There's so many different ways to come into the US. There's another question in the chat. Hang on just a second. And I am going to, whoops.
Yeah, I just saw Maria's question.
Let me pull that so that I can read it for you. Otherwise, I'm half blind. Okay, here we go. Does Sergio have any siblings that have followed his educational lead, or did he have any older siblings? Personal question about your family.
No, those are great. Ask me any questions. So one of the things I've said in many speeches across the country is that I've translated the Mexican immigrant values of physical work that my father and my mother taught me into mental work, into focus and discipline that allowed me to succeed. But it wasn't just me. So my parents, who came here with nothing. So what happened to all our siblings. So I had, and so they made us work. And I've
How many do
actually,
you have?
I'm number 3 of 4, and I'm just actually turning something off because it keeps bleeping for me. I'm on number 3 of 4, and my oldest sister, all of us graduated from college. All of us had graduate degrees.
Wow.
And my oldest sister actually lives in Middletown, Maryland. And she's a translator and is a polyglot. She knows languages. She knows Farsi, Arabic,
Oh, wow.
Spanish, English, French.
Well, whatever your family is doing, we've got to clone it.
Well, it's about, and let me just finish with all of them, just to answer Maria's question. My older brother, so I have an older sister, Diana, and then my older brother, Rudy, is a high school English teacher in El Paso at El Dorado High School. And he was just 2 years ago was Teacher of the Year.
Oh, wow.
So he's a really good English teacher. And then my younger brother, Oscar, is a superintendent at a local school district. He got his doctorate, and he's a superintendent of Anthony High School, Oscar.
Wow.
And so my parents loved education. They thought education was a way to move forward, but we, in many ways, all of us, all the siblings, had to sort of learn as we go, because they had not been to American school. They had not applied for any kind of loans here in the United States.
And what was that experience like?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things my parents did that was right, because they were Mexicanos, they were Mexican, is they were very different kind of Mexicans. And Gabriela, we started talking about this. Instead of telling us, "Oh, mijo, mija, don't go away, you're gonna leave us, and who's gonna take care of us when we're old?" They actually were very different. Because that's who their friends were like.
That's right.
They told us, no, my parents said, go and find your way. We'll help you. We don't have a lot of money, but if you want to apply to Harvard, oh, didn't John F. Kennedy go there? So it must be a good school. That's all they knew. And so they didn't know what Harvard was. They didn't know what, the schools in San Antonio were, where my brothers went. But they encouraged us to go. They said, go for your dreams. We'll help you with a few $100s every year, whatever we can, which of course barely bought pizza for us. But they encouraged us to go. And I think that was a very different mentality that many of the other parents, many of their compadres and comadres had. And so why did they have this mentality? I'm not sure. But that's who they were. They were very open-minded. Try it out. Give it a shot. And my abuelita, I had this story that I'm using in my memoir coming out, soon. I called my abuelita from Harvard, and I said, there are no Mexicans in my dorm. I want to quit. And I called her using my MCI card. I don't know if you remember those MCI cards.
Oh my God.
And so over the phone, my abuelita, who of course had a 3rd grade education and did not know anything about Harvard or Yale or anything, she scolded me. She said, Sergio, don't come back with your tail between your legs. Show them who you are.
Wow.
And so I had these unusual ancestors, grandparents and parents, who were pushing me to do what I wanted to do, even though they did not know what it was that I was doing. My parents visited me once at Harvard when I graduated.
Did they freak out?
They freaked out. I mean, it was different. There was no Mexicans. They were suddenly felt there, but I told them, don't worry, we belong here. We should fight for our place here. And that's why I started writing these stories in my books and became a writer, because I know people at Harvard and people at Yale and wherever should know these stories about my grandmother, resiliency and toughness, fighting through a pandemic. Oh my gosh, have the backbone that my grandmother had. These stories from these poor communities will teach you how to survive these difficult times. Right. But most of us in Washington and New York look at these poor communities on the border and they say, oh, they have nothing to teach us. And that's actually wrong. That's actually a huge mistake we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because and it comes also.
That's a very valid point from that's one of the things, one of the strengths we bring as a culture into American society. It's that richness, that never giving up, which you've demonstrated repeatedly. I mean, just your attitude about, discipline and terco. He's terco for
For the
Spanish as a
right
second
reason.
language means a little
Right.
stubborn, hard-headed. But I like being terca myself. It's getting things done. And I think I love what that brings to the table, because we, especially in the policy world, we delve a lot in things like graduation rates, dropout rates. This is what we don't have, and yet when you read, you also don't see kids seeing themselves
Right.
reflected in the schools. You don't
Right.
see them, they don't see people on camera in the films, etc., unless
Right.
we're the bad guy,
Right.
right? So there's a lot of things that I think your work raises up about our strengths that we should probably elevate even more than we already do,
Yeah,
collectively.
and even on that, by the way, I mean, I took my SATs and I did okay, but not great. But one of the things because Harvard has invited me to talk, and I teach at Yale,
Mm-hmm.
is I tell them what you don't measure in these scores is grit and toughness. There's
Mm-hmm.
no way to measure. And while my friends at Harvard, who were supposed to go to Harvard from New Trier or Andover, Exeter, etc.
Yeah, they were
Well,
expected to go.
oh yeah, they were getting drunk, they were having fun. What was I doing? I was working at Lamont Library until my back ached. I would
Hmm.
say 12, 15 hours, because I could not go back home a failure.
Right.
And you can't measure that kind of perseverance and toughness. And that's one of the things I tried to pass on to my kids. I said, you have the advantages that your parents have been successful, but you don't understand that you need the grit and toughness
Mm-hmm.
to get to these places and not just survive but thrive. And so my
Right.
just to kind of just very briefly, because I love bragging about my kids, because they had the both sides. They had the advantages of having some money in the Upper West Side, and my wife and I have been relatively successful. But I also taught them to work beyond what their peers were doing. As I say, like a Mexican, Saturdays and Sundays, I gave them extra math work. I tore apart their essays. Every summer, they had
Wow.
to do another
Tough dad.
language. And so not only are they fluent in Spanish, Isaac learned German and Aaron learned Russian apart from English. Every summer they had to take extra math classes and press ahead. And so one of the most prestigious schools in New York City, what happened when they graduated from high school? Well, my son was the only one who scored a 2400 on his SAT.
Whoa.
And my other son, who came 2 years later, missed it by one or two questions. He got only a 2300. He was the laggard.
Little sibling rivalry there.
Well, but what I'm telling you is it is not about they're brilliant naturally or genetic. It is
They worked
they
hard.
they were working as soon as they were toddlers and doing things that their peers were not doing. They
Mm-hmm.
were taking extra classes. I was pushing them, because I told them this is how I was translating the Mexican immigrant values that I learned from my parents into intellectual work and toughness and not be defeated. And
Mm-hmm.
and what are they doing now? Isaac was appointed the youngest commissioner in Chicago by the mayor of Chicago. This kid is
That's crazy.
25 to be on the Citizens Police Commission that oversees the multi-billion-dollar budget of the police. And he graduated from the University of Chicago. His mentor is David Axelrod.
Oh my goodness.
And then the other kid, Aaron, the older kid, he won a White House fellowship, went to Yale Law School, and with a dual degree at the Yale School of the Environment. And it's not that they're brilliant; it is they work harder than their peers. And
Right.
this is translating the immigrant values I learned in Ysleta so that they can, as I say, kick ass anywhere. They leave no doubt who's the best person in this situation to elevate. And so this is I've been an evangelist for that, because people
I think that's incredible.
don't really realize this is what you learn from poor immigrants. This
Right.
is what the grit, this toughness, this resiliency, this I am not privileged, the opposite. I
Mm.
need to bust my ass to work harder than anyone else so that I separate myself over time with what I do. Does
You know,
is that too much?
no, it's amazing. And actually you're clicking my head on, these issues of identity, right? Um, there's a moment in the book where uh I think it's Turi, where he says, who he sees in his head is not how others see him.
Right.
And this is throughout the book, but I hear it in what you're saying in life. Like this is part of the identity piece, this resilience, this immigrant grittiness that you come and you conquer, and you go for it. What do you have to lose? And you thrive on it, and then you pass it on to the next generation. Like that identity. I don't think the world at large sees that in us.
Right. No, and you're judged superficially all the time. I'm still the only Mexican American teaching in my program at the Yale Writers Workshop. But over time, they now know, oh my gosh, he's a really good teacher. Oh my gosh, his students have won the biggest awards
And he writes
in
well
and he writes well. And so
in
you stop.
English.
Right, exactly. So you stop being judged in this superficial manner, which I'm used to. I walk in the door and who is this guy with the funny name? Who's Mexican, who's sort of outspoken.
Mhm.
And so people do that all the time, and you have to overcome that judgment from the outside. And sometimes, by the way, by other Latinos.
Yes, this is true. Um, you know, I suffer from the you're not Mexican enough, or when I'm in Mexico and over here, well, you're a Latina, you're a Mexican. So
Right.
I live on the border. What can I say? So we've got about a little under 10 minutes left. I want you, because we usually take the last 5 minutes. I'll hand it over to Veronica to wrap up for us. But I want you to talk to us a little bit about, you've said a lot of really amazing things about our Mexican culture, about border culture, about the impacts of different, like when things connect, right? And how your familismo expresses itself in your art. What about outcomes? So what are the most important takeaways from your book you want us to know? We started at the beginning of our conversation talking a little bit about that. But really, what is your best hope for this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is to understand how community is formed among this group of 3 kids,
Mm,
17, who are outsiders. Because that's really ultimately why I wrote the book. I believe the greatest problem, I've written an essay about this in the United States, is that we are not a we. We are not coming together culturally, politically, ethnically, racially. We're losing our sense that we belong to each other. And these 3 kids, despite the gauntlet, despite these bad people coming after them, despite all sorts of terrible things that happen to them, they never give up on their American dream. They
right,
never give up fighting for it.
right.
And so I
Or
wrote it
believing that it can happen.
believing that it can happen. And this sacrificing, sometimes physically sacrificing for each one person for the other two. Sometimes it's Molly, sometimes it's Duty, sometimes it's Arnulfo.
And Rufo paid the ultimate price,
Is
but
is
you'll
is
see it when you read
is
the book.
right. It is what saves them. It's what creates
Yeah.
this unbreakable bond. And I think we've forgotten that in this country. So
Mm,
this is a book about how these outsiders form their own community and keep fighting for these dreams. And some of
hmm.
them, by the way, based on reading and what they believe America should be, and how reading spurs imagination to think of yourself beyond the poverty you began.
Right.
To think of yourself, I can go, for them, Connecticut is just sort of an abstraction until they get there. Because
It's like a
Connecticut,
concept. Like
it's a
it's so
concept.
random.
Right. Well, it's New England. It's the beginning of the
Right.
country.
Right. Right.
And by the way, that's where the novel, the title comes from. I was asked to give, just very quickly, I was asked to give a very famous lecture called the White Fund Lecture in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And it's a lecture that's been around for over 100 years. Ernest Hemingway gave it.
Oh, wow.
Junot Diaz gave it. And they pay you a
Junot
lot of
Diaz gave it. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and they pay you a lot of money, thousands of dollars to give this lecture. And so I went,
Representando.
right, exactly. And when I gave it, I went back to the origin of who created the lecture, a guy named Judge Appleton White. And he was a contemporary of Thoreau and Emerson.
Oh, wow.
In the mid 1800s. And he began creating the Salem Lyceum. And the lyceums were like the first public libraries to educate poor people who didn't have money to go to Harvard or Yale, but wanted to hear lectures, wanted to take some sort of workshop, and
oftentimes they were immigrant communities as well.
Yeah. And so one of the things I discovered at the Harvard libraries, was Judge Appleton White's memoir. And so what is he saying? And he's writing it in the 1840s. And what is he saying in this memoir? He's complaining to the rich people of New England back then, who are all ancestors of the Pilgrims. He said, your ancestors 2 or 3 generations ago came here with nothing, and now you've become very well-to-do, and you don't want to help create a lyceum. You don't want to help the new English immigrants coming in the mid-19th century. And so I said, I understand this story, that the immigrants that come here, and then their ancestors, the following generations who make it, they forget the struggle. They forget to come and help others who are the new immigrants. And of course this happened with Jewish immigrants and Irish immigrants and Mexican immigrants and now Latin American immigrants, that where you
Asian.
have
all
Asian
the world is
immigrants.
here.
Right. You make it, and then you say, close the door. And don't let other people in, or let's not help.
You pull up the ladder.
Right. And so he's complaining about this within his own community. And he's saying, don't you remember how your great grandparents came as pilgrims here in with the Mayflower, and now you don't want to help the new immigrants coming in. And so that's why I titled it Nobody's Pilgrims, because these Turi, Arnulfo, and Molly are the new pilgrims, are the people who really remind us of the promise, but that grit that it takes to achieve that promise. And that is fundamentally how our country began. Wow.
Bravo. I'm going to open it up to Veronica and let her wrap us up. I am just thrilled that we've had this conversation. Go ahead, Veronica.
No, this is amazing, Sergio. I mean, like a big, gigantic pat on the back on your success, your kids' success. Me metiste envidia. I was like,
no.
But the fact that you translated that immigrant value to your children in the United States when we're comfortable, and it's I have my own children, 19 and 21, and that's a challenge for me. How do I relay that grit, that persistence that we grew up with and made us successful and has us here because we don't give up? And it's not the same aquí en los Estados Unidos, obviamente. But I cannot wait to dive into the book. I'm on Amazon shopping. Grabbing
and tell your friends, Gabriela, because it really does mean so much to somebody who works for years on a book.
Yeah.
And has struggled so hard to get our stories out there.
Yeah.
To have readers that really appreciate what you're trying to do.
Well, and I think that's key. And I think we need to address that. Every time I work, we do Hispanic engagement. We work with governments, nonprofits. They hire us to bring them to the Latino market. And for me to sell, for me to get a yes, to have money and a budget to pay for our services takes years, months, but it's the business case. We constantly have to document that there are many of us, and we do have money. And one of the latest reports came out that we're generating $3 trillion in GDP. But they don't understand that until they see the numbers. So when publishers, authors, even our children, our own students, don't think we have worthy stories, they don't think they matter. So I think a very important thing about today and you is we have to put our mouth where our talk is, right? Our money where our mouth is. We have to buy the book. That's why I intentionally posted the question. We cannot expect the world to hear us and support us if we don't support ourselves.
That's
From
Exactly.
campaigns to businesses to arts. And you're our voice, right? So when you talk about your abuelita and you talk about her power and her strength, I'm envisioning, oh my God, that's how our children should grow up, hearing that this is normal, that this is where we came from. In your success, you know, okay, I was in college, no one looked like me. And your abuelita que no sabía nada de nada, but she knew the right stuff. Quédate ahí, you know, show them what you're made of. So I think what's really urgent for everyone here and for the people that will watch this later in our newsletter, Gabriela, I think we definitely have to have a conversation around economics, right? And as a consumer, el dinero que tenemos, that power, we don't think it's big. Yes, it is.
It's massive.
Right, you know, and I think distilling best practices like Christmas is coming or whatever you celebrate, buy books, give a book, give a Kindle, give an audio, lo que sea, but also pay for it. And, you know, what you said, Sergio, share it, give me a review. It's not a big deal for me to spend 2 minutes, but to you, it's one more times 100 times 20. That expands.
And you know what happens? Publishers notice.
Of course.
Publishers notice. Oh, look, he's getting so many reviews. So the next book, oh, there's going to be a lot of interest. And you know, and this publisher from New York, which is where Lee and Lowe is from, they just put out the audiobook too with Nobody's Pilgrims, and they actually paid a very well-known actor to do it. And they said, you can do it, Sergio, but we're willing to pay for this. A guy who's a Latino.
Oh my God, even better.
Yeah, exactly. Who was on Narcos, who
Share
was
the
on
love.
Grey's Anatomy, and you know, he said we're willing to pay for it because this really reads well. And so the audiobook just came out, and so you know, but getting to that point where you're being supported by publishers, it's been such a long journey.
And that's why I asked.
Yeah, it all begins with the market. It all begins with other readers.
So there's a lot of questions on the chat that I know we're over. So if you have to drop off, I understand. But we have to take the actions. We don't do that. And then we complain later. Ay, que no me hacen caso, no me ayudan, no hay recursos. Did you show up? So listen to me. You have to, I'm on Amazon and the book prices range depending on Kindle, Audible, you know, full. Buy the book, buy it as a gift, read it. Please, before the week is out, buy the book, whatever way you can afford it. Talk about it on social media, share it. So maybe you can't afford it, but share it. I'm gonna read it so that people begin to see it, because those little tiny actions by you really amplify your network of 500, 10,000, 7,000 friends that sees that post. It's how we help change the narrative. So the kids that are coming, it's not even about us. It's the kids that are coming afterwards, the pilgrims that Sergio writes about.
And I wrote this book for my kids and their generation.
They don't think we belong. They feel weird. I'm too Latina, I'm too Afro-Latina, I'm too Dominican, I'm too much of an accent. No one's like me, no one. And we're having a mental health crisis because there's no connection. So if they don't see themselves somewhere,
in literature and movies and TV shows, and I'm constantly coming up, you know, against that, and trying to break through in many ways.
I mean, like
we should try to get your book made into a movie.
Into the schools.
My agent got some Hollywood people, and so now I have a Hollywood agent who's looking actually at this book. Because it reads very fast, and
it does.
That would be super cool,
and it's super graphic. I mean, I can just see the movie.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. So, not to be labeled, not to steal too much of your time. the homework, as you guys know, I'm very, very practical. It's really, let's show up.
Right.
Let's show up for our kids, for Sergio, for the next set of authors. If you have a story to tell, start writing, start publishing, start talking about it, but simple. Buy the book. Christmas is coming. I want everyone to buy this book. Punto. Y hablarlo, y hablarlo. He should have 10 reviews before the week and the month is out. So I am Duff on my,
Oh, she does this to all of us.
Thank
She
you.
keeps us
Thank you
all
very
in line.
much. I'm so grateful for your words.
Thank you.
Un placer, un placer. Y te felicitamos. It's amazing
Igual.
what you've accomplished.
Mil
Thank you
gracias.
for being our voice.
Thank you for being our voice. Thank you for sharing our narrative. Thank you for putting it in a positive light, but also really realistically. I think that, I'm so excited that you were able to join us. And I can't, like I said at the beginning, I can't believe you said yes. So let's keep this rolling, and welcome to the MLU family, because, you know, we're like, once you
Thank
get
you.
into this family, there's no getting out.
Thank you. And let me know what else I can do. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you. Well, yeah, we'll take you on the road with us. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, MLU is here to help convene new voices, interesting people, intellectuals, grassroots workers, organizers. Everybody should have a voice, and we're proud to provide it. Have a great week, and what's left of it. So weekend, I guess. And we will see you next month. We're going to move the date to the Thursday. Normally, this is the fourth Thursday of the month. So we're going to move it one up because we don't want to get into the Thanksgiving range. So lots to talk about. Thank you, Sergio, again.